Welcome to a night that locals still whisper about, when the forest of southern Georgia seemed to breathe. The air itself trembled, as if something immense was moving just beyond the range of human sight. No gunfire, no storm, only the rhythmic sound of pine needles brushing against each other like soft warning bells. They called it the night of the midnight panther, though no one ever agreed on what they saw. A shadow taller than a man, heavier than a deer, moving soundlessly across the logging road near the Ocmulgee Basin. Hunters froze. Dogs refused to bark. Lanterns dimmed on their own. In the darkness between the trees, something watched them back. By dawn, nothing remained, no tracks, no carcass, no sound, just a line of crushed grass leading toward the water. The sheriff's men followed it, thinking they were tracking a wildcat. But the stride was wrong, too long for any known feline, too steady for a man. The report filed that week, dated November 7th, 1935, described an unidentified creature moving with deliberate intelligence. It was dismissed as hysteria born from prohibition stress, yet the file was stamped with a note, unexplained. Recurrent. The word would appear again in 1942, 1954, 1961, always near the same forests, always near midnight. Some said it was a remnant of the panthers that once roamed the South before industrial clear-cutting wiped them out. Others swore it was something older a guardian left behind when the Creek people were forced from these lands a century earlier. In every version, the creature was not a predator, but a witness, a dark sentinel walking the border between wilderness and what replaced it. Men built sawmills. Trains screamed through pine hollows. But every few years someone vanished near the river, always alone, always at night, and the same description came back, two eyes like coals under the moon. The state archives in Atlanta still keep fragments of these testimonies. A lumberman's diary from 1937 notes, "The men will not camp beyond the 3rd-mile marker. They say something stands near the tree line when the moon is high." A WPA field interviewer collecting folk songs in 1939 recorded a woman from Hawkinsville humming a tune that ended with the line, "He walks when men forget to listen." The cylinder recording is warped, but her voice trembles at the final note, as if she remembered seeing it herself. By the 1950s, locals began calling it the Watcher. Not beast, not ghost, just the Watcher. Teenagers driving the back roads left offerings, a cigarette pack, a coin. Sometimes a note folded into pine bark. They said if you disrespected the forest, your headlights would flicker and a shadow would cross the road ahead of you, massive, weightless, gone before you could breathe. Reports made their way to the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. Rangers dismissed them until one of their own filed a statement. Large feline form observed near Route 90. No animal sound. Vehicle battery drained within minutes. Folklore turned into evidence, then back into myth. Journalists arrived after the 1971 incident, the night a bus of traveling performers stalled near the same stretch of forest, and the driver swore he saw a shape taller than the front grille. The story ran in the Macon Telegraph for 2 days, before being quietly removed. But archived microfilm still holds the headline, "Phantom in the Pines." Science offered explanations, melanistic bobcats, optical illusions, even military experiments during the Cold War. But none accounted for the pattern of sightings mapped across 3 generations, always within the same 7-mile radius, always near the Ocmulgee River. Satellite data decades later would show a corridor of untouched woodland threading through modern farmland, as if some invisible boundary had been protecting it. Hunters called it cursed. Ecologists called it an anomaly of preservation. The elders of the nearby creek community had another term, the remembering place. And so we begin here, in the whispering pines of South Georgia, where time folds between logging scars and legends. Imagine the humidity thick enough to cling to your skin, the air humming with cicadas, and the faint smell of sap burning in the distance. A single lantern sways from a fence post. a man walks home late from the mill, his boots heavy with red clay. He stops because he feels watched. Not the ordinary unease of a night alone, but the primal awareness that somewhere in the dark, another set of lungs has matched his breathing. He turns, and the world seems to hold its breath. What he sees will never make it into the morning paper. No camera captures it, no photograph survives. Only his voice remains recorded years later on brittle magnetic tape. It wasn't just eyes. It was the feeling that the woods were thinking back. This is the story of that feeling, the silent predator that may not hunt for blood, but for memory itself. The midnight panther of Georgia. The one that kept the woods untouched by war, by fire, by time. Before we begin, leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this line. Because somewhere maybe far from Georgia, someone else is listening at the same hour, and maybe hearing the same sound, the whisper of pine needles moving like breath just before the forest goes still. April 1935. South Georgia. A land stitched together by pines, rivers, and red clay roads that glow after rain. The air hangs heavy with sap and the slow hum of insects. The sun bleeds through the treetops like amber poured from a cracked jar. And somewhere beyond that horizon, where the Ocmulgee bends through shadow, there are places where even light seems to hesitate. People here live between silence and survival. Small towns with names that vanish from maps. Abbeville, Lumber City, Rhine, each built around a mill, a depot, a row of weathered shacks. Every dawn whistles echo through the fog, summoning men to work. Every dusk, the forest swallows the sound. And always, the trees stand watching. This is Georgia before the highways, before the neon, before the world got loud. The Great Depression is still clawing its way through the South. Timber contracts keep a few families fed, but the woods take more than they give. Logging crews work from sunrise to moonrise, axes flashing in rhythm metal, striking resin sap, spraying like tears. Sometimes men say the echoes answer back. The WPA files from 1935 to 1938 describe a curious tension among rural workers in the Ocmulgee Basin. One supervisor, W.E. Dillard, wrote, "Our men avoid certain groves. They claim to hear movement behind them, though no one's there." These reports were never meant for folklore. They were payroll memos, buried among fuel receipts and rations. But the pattern repeats. Every mention tied to the same coordinates, Pine Hollow, Route 90, the southern bend of the river. At night, that bend turns darker than pitch. No lantern light can reach the other side. Locals say the trees there grow closer together, their branches twisting above like ribs closing over a secret. The river widens, deepens, slows, as if the earth itself is holding its breath. And it's here along this bend that the Watcher is said to appear. Not every night, not every generation, just when men forget who the forest belongs to. By 1935, the timber companies had begun pushing deeper into Creek ancestral land. Surveyors cut straight lines through centuries of unbroken green. But the farther they went, the stranger their instruments behaved. Compasses wavered. Horses refused to cross certain trails. A foreman noted 3 mules stopped at the same spot, turned their heads and would not move. The entry ends abruptly, ink smudged by rain or maybe sweat. The locals called these things coincidences. But the elders of the Muskogee Nation didn't. They said the woods had spirits that remembered, that every tree held the breath of a warrior who once walked beneath it. When the land was carved and sold, those breaths didn't leave, they waited, waiting for someone to notice what had been forgotten. The 1930s South was a place of contradictions. Radios crackled with jazz from New Orleans, while men still plowed with mules. Children played under telegraph poles that hummed like thin ghosts. And amid that fragile modernity, the myth of the Midnight Panther began to feel like more than a story. It was a metaphor for what survived change. The panther, black as the night it ruled, became the emblem of what refused to be tamed. There are photographs, grainy overexposed, showing logging camps near Abbeville. In the background, pines tilt under their own weight, trunks scarred by axes. In the foreground, men stand stiffly beside their tools. But if you look long enough, if you let your eyes drift to the shadow line between the trees, there's always one patch of darkness that doesn't seem to match the rest. Archivists call it a trick of the lens. Locals say it's proof. Weather here shapes memory. Rain doesn't fall. It lingers, curling into fog that moves like breath. The soil stays soft, erasing tracks before morning. If something walked these woods, no one could prove it. Yet everyone knew when it had been near. The woods went still. Dogs hid under porches. Owls stopped mid-call. And in the silence that followed, hearts began to race for reasons no one could name. The Ocmulgee itself carries layers of history like sediment. Beneath its brown surface lie broken pottery musket balls, fragments of steamboat iron. Every flood brings a relic back to light. Children once played by the riverbank, finding arrowheads and coins, not realizing they were touching timelines, touching bones of stories buried twice, once by time, once by shame. The watcher, they said, guarded those stories. It wasn't hunting, it was remembering. As war approached in Europe, the people of Georgia had no idea how quickly the outside world would intrude. 1939 brought the hum of military surveys, the construction of new depots, the whispers of mobilization. Soldiers trained in the same forests that once belonged to tribes now erased from the maps. At night, recruits told each other tales by the fire about eyes seen in the dark, about a shadow that moved between their tents without sound. Some laughed, others prayed. The Department of Defense later recorded 2 training accidents in those woods, both attributed to night disorientation. No further investigation followed. But one memo signed by an officer named Colson includes a curious postscript. Men refuse to bivouac near river edge. Claim presence beyond camp. Request alternate ground. Meanwhile, farmers nearby began to notice strange patterns. Livestock missing, fences broken, yet no blood, no struggle. Just silence. And the woods each morning seemed untouched, as if nothing living had ever passed through. When the local paper tried to run a story, the headline was edited at the last minute. The new title read, "Only Strange Stillness in the South." Through all of this, one truth remained. The forest stayed intact. While surrounding counties stripped their land bare, the Ocmulgee corridor remained stubbornly wild. Every attempt to clear it failed. Machinery stalled. Workers quit. Lightning struck twice in the same valley, burning the equipment, but sparing the trees. The superintendent called it an act of God. The elders called it justice. Now imagine this world through the camera's eye. A slow pan across a sea of pine trunks, the wind weaving through their needles like invisible thread. A faint hum of insects rises, fades. Then nothing. The shot widens. Fog drifts across the frame. And somewhere far to the right, just where the trees overlap, the silhouette of something crouched low, unmoving, watching. The music falls away. The narrator's voice lowers. This is where the story begins. In the heart of a forest that never stopped listening, the camera pulls closer, almost against your will. You feel the air tighten. The pine needles glisten like glass. The sound design swells with the rhythm of breath, yours or something else's. And as the lens catches a flicker of movement, a shimmer, a shift in the dark, you realize the shape has been there all along. It doesn't roar. It doesn't move. It simply exists, patient, ancient, inevitable. The midnight panther, the watcher, the memory of a land that refused to forget itself. The records begin quietly, tucked between agricultural ledgers and forestry reports, as if the story didn't belong to myth but to routine paperwork. Georgia State Archive Box 14 Section D 1935 to 1956. Wildlife Anomalies, Okmulgee Region. 38 pages. Typewritten. Some brittle, some still smelling faintly of carbon ink. The first entry is brief clinical, without embellishment. Report received from Telfair County Sheriff's Office. Subject unidentified animal sighting near Route 90. Tracks inconsistent with known fauna. No injuries or damage reported. No injuries, no damage, just fear. The next few lines mention something strange length of stride, 1.8. 8 meters between impressions, depth inconsistent with soil density. There's a sketch attached 2 ovals, long and narrow, drawn by a deputy named Ellis Monroe. He noted that the prints appeared and disappeared within 20 feet, as if the creature walked part way, then lifted from the ground. 2 days later, the report was forwarded to the Department of Natural Resources in Atlanta. A reply came stamped in red, unsubstantiated. Advise no further inquiry unless livestock loss documented. The case was closed, but not forgotten, because the pattern returned again and again. By 1937, 5 additional reports had surfaced, all from counties touching the Okmulgee Basin. The handwriting changes, but the tone remains identical. Confusion wrapped in formality. No sound recorded. Observed movement without visual confirmation. Animals behaving erratically, silence before motion. In one report, a ranger underlined a single sentence 3 times. Witness states, eyes appeared before the body became visible. Between 1938 and 1941, the Civilian Conservation Corps worked in the same region, mapping soil composition and drainage systems. Their daily logs mentioned something unscientific: workers refusing to enter certain groves, claiming their compasses spun in circles. Officially, the Corps attributed the disturbance to magnetic ore deposits. Yet geological surveys later found none. Still, the language of bureaucracy hides emotion in its margins. In an internal memo from April 1940, a district engineer named F.C. Lawton wrote, "I cannot explain what we saw. We were 6 men sober, equipped, and trained. The object moved against wind direction, silent, upright. It stopped when we stopped. It followed our path until we left the forest." The next line is almost tender in its restraint. We did not discuss it again. When World War II began, most of those men went overseas. But the watcher didn't rest. A new kind of witness emerged: pilots. During 1943 to 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces maintained navigation training flights across southern Georgia. At least 3 flight debriefs described dark mass observed on ground movement inconsistent with known fauna. One instructor wrote, "It appeared like a shadow cast upward, impossible under existing light." The notation was filed under optical disturbance. But when the same instructor, Captain Harlan Webb, returned from deployment in 1946, he requested to revisit the coordinates. His personal log, archived at Warner Robins Museum, includes this line: "Still there, still moving when wind does not." By 1949, local journalists had begun collecting rumors, not for publication, but curiosity. The Macon Telegraph held a folder labeled Panther File Unofficial. Inside were 7 handwritten notes, mostly second-hand accounts, a fisherman's wife, a schoolteacher, 2 hunters, 1 rail inspector, 1 farmhand, and a mail carrier. Each one describes eyes reflecting amber, not white or red, a biological impossibility in local wildlife. When a biologist named Dr. Robert McCreary investigated in 1951, he proposed an explanation: melanistic cougar subspecies displaced from Florida. But his report contradicted itself. No cougar carcasses, no scat, no tracks consistent with a known species. He concluded reluctantly, unverified presence may represent remnant population. Yet field photographs tell another story. Frame 12 of McCreary's roll, preserved though overexposed, shows pine trunks in fog. But between them, blurred motion. Too wide for a deer, too tall for a man low to the ground, but elongated. When the negative was enhanced decades later, a faint curvature of a tail appears, then vanishes into static grain. The technician's note reads simply, "Something was there." Beyond the scientists, the locals continued their own documentation. The Georgia Folklore Society compiled oral histories through the 1950s, funded by Emory University. Their transcripts mention the black one that follows in at least 9 counties. The earliest witness in that archive was an 82-year-old Creek descendant named Sarah Yahola. Her words translated from Muskogee remain etched into the tape. It was not a cat. It was memory with 4 legs. Her phrasing haunted researchers. For her, the creature wasn't an anomaly, it was continuity, an embodiment of resistance. Where paper erased, the forest remembered. Still, the state needed logic. By 1960, the Ocmulgee corridor became part of a wildlife study zone. Motion sensors were installed, primitive analogs set to trigger on heat differential. Over a span of 3 months, 14 triggers occurred. In half of them, no form was captured. The remainder showed distortion, elongated blur heat signatures in motion, but no outline. Engineers blamed equipment faults caused by humidity. But the devices had worked perfectly the nights before and after. At this point, a new entry appeared in Federal Correspondence Subject Code PHN D7. The classification phenomenon Delta 7 referenced unidentified biological entities. For years, that code would appear in weather defense and ecological archives, always tied to remote locations, always with missing photographic proof. The final page of the 1962 report carries a typewritten summary. Conclusion: recurrent sightings suggest localized atmospheric or psychological phenomena. Recommend suspension of further fieldwork due to funding constraints. Yet handwritten in pencil along the margin are 6 quiet words, perhaps from the archivist herself. Or maybe we stopped looking, and then silence again. For nearly 2 decades, no formal records mention the watcher. The world moved on, highways cut through old routes, mills turned into suburbs, memory into myth. But deep within environmental logs, the trace persisted. Temperature anomalies, magnetic irregularities, unexplained interference in low-band radio signals near the same coordinates. Modern analysis run by students at the University of Georgia in 1987 found something subtle, a microclimate differential. Within a 3-mile radius around the Ocmulgee Bend, temperature and moisture levels fluctuate independently of surrounding zones. The forest breathes differently, as if it maintains its own heartbeat. Was it the soil composition? Possibly. Was it the dense pine canopy retaining humidity? Maybe. But what if the anomaly wasn't environmental at all? What if the data captured not heat, but presence? Fact folds into folklore here, and the paper trail ends where instinct begins. Every statistic echoes a heartbeat. Every blurred photograph becomes testimony. The midnight panther may never fit into taxonomy or science, but it fits perfectly into memory. And memory leaves its own tracks. Not in soil, not in evidence, but in the way men write and the way they stop writing when they are afraid. In 1963, the final entry in the Wildlife Anomalies file reads, "Only region observed clear. No disturbance recorded. Local population maintains belief. Belief as a variable, belief as data." And perhaps that is where fact ends and legend begins again. His name was Samuel Sam Larkin, born 1908, a man who never left the woods. By the time the modern world reached Georgia, Sam had already spent 40 years among the pines, cutting, hauling, breathing their resin until his skin smelled like turpentine. He lived alone in a shack near the Ocmulgee Bend, roof patched with tin walls lined with newspapers from a decade ago. Every morning he lit his pipe before sunrise and sat on the porch listening. He once told a WPA interviewer in 1939, "You can tell a forest's mood by its sound. When it hums, it's alive. When it goes quiet, Something's walking that don't belong. The tape crackles when you play it, a voice worn thin but steady. In the background there's wind. And then faintly, the slow rasp of pine needles scraping wood. Samuel Larkin was no fool, no dreamer. He was a man of habits and calluses, the kind who measured days in the number of logs hauled, and not the passing of hours. He'd fought in France during the Great War, came home with a scar on his shoulder and a silence that never left. His neighbors said he didn't talk much after 1919. He listened instead. To rain, to owls, to the river turning in its bed at night. But what he heard one summer evening in 1952, he said, was different. The journal he kept found after his death, its pages brown and curling, begins with a single sentence. Something out there remembers me. The night of July 17th. Moon half hidden, air heavy, unmoving. The frogs had stopped calling. His hound Reggie pressed its body against the door, trembling. Sam stood at the window pipe, unlit eyes narrowed. He wrote that he could feel the weight of a gaze, not sharp, not hostile, but deliberate. Like a man staring through glass. He stepped outside anyway. He always did. The path behind his cabin sloped toward the river, a narrow trail bordered by palmetto and pine. The smell of wet earth clung to his boots. Every step echoed too loud, as though the night had been emptied of every other sound. He stopped once halfway down, not from fear, but recognition. He said it felt like the air was waiting for him to speak first. He didn't. At the clearing, the moon slid from a cloud. The river shone like a vein of steel. That's when he saw it across the bank, still as a root shape half swallowed by fog. Two eyes, low glowing dull amber. Not bright, not reflection, emission. He didn't move. Neither did it. For one long minute, both stood suspended, man and shadow mirrored in the water's skin. Then the creature turned its head slow and precise, as though acknowledging him, and stepped backward into the dark. The sound that followed was not a growl, not a branch breaking, but something smaller. Breathing. Deep, steady, human almost. He wrote later, I knew then it was not after me. It was after the noise, after the forgetting. In the weeks that followed, Sam changed. The neighbors noticed he no longer cut the trees near his cabin. He left small pieces of salt pork on stumps for the wildcat, he said. But he stopped hunting. He stopped setting traps. When asked why, he replied softly, "Some things ain't meant to be cornered." People thought he was going senile. But he wasn't. He had clarity, the kind that frightens. In 1953, the local game warden visited. He found Sam on his porch writing. The warden's later statement notes, subject appeared lucid, spoke of large animal near river, claimed it thinks like a man. When questioned about details, subject smiled and said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you how quiet it was." That was their last conversation. 2 months later, Sam disappeared. His cabin stood untouched, lamp still full, food still on the table. Only his hound remained found, beneath the porch, alive but silent. No sign of struggle, no tracks. The sheriff's report listed the case as missing adult, presumed drowned. But his boat was tied rope uncut. A week later, a fisherman downstream found something drifting in the reeds. Not a body, not clothing, just a notebook wrapped in wax cloth. Inside were pages warped by humidity, handwriting. Uneven ink bled at the edges. The final entry read, "It's not hunting me. It's guarding something, a sound, maybe the memory of quiet." Then below that line, one word repeated 5 times, "Listen." When his journal reached Atlanta, archivists didn't know what to make of it. One called it folk delirium, another psychological projection of isolation. Yet one researcher, a young woman named Ann Russell, attached a note that still clings to the file, handwriting steady. Thought pattern consistent. Subject likely sane. Years later, a ranger claimed to have seen Larkin's cabin again, long abandoned, swallowed by ivy. And inside on the wall, above the hearth, claw marks. Parallel, deliberate, 6 feet from the floor. too high for a dog, too straight for storm damage. He didn't file a report. He just told a friend over coffee in Hawkinsville, the place still listens. The story might have ended there. Another lost name swallowed by folklore, if not for one reel of film. Georgia Forestry Service training exercise standard footage of controlled burns and soil surveys. The camera pans left nothing unusual then right. For half a second, a flicker. A dark shape moving at the frame's edge between two trees. No roar, no jump. Just motion, smooth, soundless, deliberate. The cameraman years later admitted he hadn't seen it until playback. The footage was never public. But when transferred to digital decades later, that single frame caught a researcher's attention. Behind the shape in the smoke, two faint pinpoints of light. Amber. Maybe reflection, maybe not. Samuel Larkin's cabin no longer exists. It burned in a lightning fire sometime in the late 60s, the kind that consumes everything except the chimney. But when state officials visited to assess damage, they noted something strange. The fire had stopped at the tree line. Every pine within 10 feet of the cabin stood untouched green, as if it had rained only there. The foreman interviewed in 1970 shrugged and said, like something drew a circle round it and told the flames to stop. And within that circle on the ground, embedded in ash, a single brass button army issue, circa 1918, stamped with the insignia of the American Expeditionary Forces, Larkins. Fact or coincidence? Depends on how you listen. They say the woods around Ocmulgee still fall silent some nights. No birds, no crickets, no wind. As if something is taking attendance. Counting who still remembers. Locals driving those back roads talk about headlights dimming near the old Bend radios cutting to static. One trucker said he heard breathing through the static, a slow exhale that matched his own. He turned the dial, but the voice whispered one word before fading. Listen. Just like Sam wrote, and if you stand there long enough, if you let the silence wrap around you, the way it wrapped around him, you begin to understand maybe it wasn't madness that took him. Maybe it was the forest calling back what belonged to it. The man who listened too closely and heard something listening back. For decades, the forest kept its silence. The files slept. The name Midnight Panther faded from paper and from speech. But the land remembered. Then came the satellites, the drones, the data. In 1982, the U.S. Geological Survey began mapping thermal anomalies across the southern states, part of a larger study on land retention and moisture flux. When their thermal sensors passed over the Ocmulgee corridor, they noticed something strange, a strip of forest cooler than its surroundings by nearly 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite identical elevation, soil type, and vegetation density. They ran it twice. The result didn't change. The report was filed quietly under anomalous thermal inversion. No one cared until 1989. That year, the Georgia Department of Forestry began introducing infrared wildlife tracking, a test run across 6 counties. Within the Ocmulgee tract, their sensors picked up multiple moving heat signatures. Large, low to the ground, consistent in rhythm, but with no visible bodies. Rangers were dispatched. They found nothing but mist and prints that ended mid-trail. The supervisor's comment, handwritten in margin, if it's an error, it's a persistent one. By the early 1990s, technology caught up with curiosity. Students from Emory University, working on an ecology grant, installed motion-triggered cameras near the Bend, the same ground where Sam Larkin once lived. Over 6 months, they recorded 213 nights of footage. One clip stood apart. Time-stamped 2:17 a.m., May 6, 1991. A deer freezes mid-frame. Its ears twitch. Off-screen, a soundless shift of air. Then, for a fraction of a second, a darker shape moves behind it. No clear outline, no fur texture, only displacement, a ripple through fog. The deer bolts. The grass bends. The fog folds like a curtain drawn. When the footage was enhanced, a frame-by-frame breakdown revealed something chilling, a pair of faint amber glows at shoulder height. Not reflection, emission. The same hue described in 1935. The data was logged under unknown optical interference. But the lead researcher, Dr. Jane Ellison, refused to stop there. Her field notes read, "If this were light contamination, the wavelengths would scatter." They don't. They remain centered as if 2 points of thermal focus exist independently of source mass. That line triggered attention. Within weeks, the footage was classified for review under the Office of Environmental Monitoring. The official statement released in 1993 concluded, "Phenomenon attributed to mist lensing and double exposure. No biological entity confirmed." But off the record, Ellison told a journalist later that year, the lens didn't fail. Something moved, then nothing for a decade, until 2004. NASA's Terra satellite captured another anomaly. Same coordinates, same elliptical footprint, now smaller, pulsing faintly at night temperature cycles. Scientists argued it was residual heat retention in peat deposits. Yet spectral readings showed emission patterns unlike any natural formation. Parallel to that, the Georgia Bureau of Environmental Analysis logged another report, localized magnetic distortion interfering with GPS. Rangers described compass drift up to 7 degrees within a 2-mile radius, identical to 1940 CCC accounts. Technology had advanced, but the forest's tricks remained the same. By 2007, modern curiosity arrived again, this time through local hunters carrying infrared scopes. 2 separate videos surfaced online, each filmed at night along Route 90. Both clips show a figure moving just beyond infrared lock, always in thermal shadow, colder than the air around it. The forums called it the Black Zero. Viewers laughed. But one frame examined by independent analysts revealed something else, a glint of light. Twin points suspended mid-motion. Again, that same impossible amber. In 2010, Emory University returned now with funding from NOAA. They called it the Ocmulgee Atmospheric Resonance Project. Their goals study unusual sound frequencies in the forest during nocturnal temperature drops. What they found was silence, a measurable physical silence. Acoustic sensors registered sound absorption far beyond normal forest dampening, a frequency dip so complete that ambient noise vanished for intervals of 18 to 22 seconds. It was as if something there absorbed not sound, but intention. One technician compared it to standing inside a living lung that had just exhaled. When cross-referenced with motion sensors, every dip in sound corresponded with mild fluctuations in electromagnetic field strength. The pattern repeated 3 times, always between midnight and 2 a.m. The researchers called it the listening window. Fact, not fiction. Recorded, verified, repeated. Still, official language stayed cautious. Phenomenon localized. Possible interaction between humidity gradients and magnetic soil minerals. But internal correspondence paints a different picture. Email from project lead, Dr. Ellison, dated March 22, 2010. "We measured heartbeat rhythm without a heart. 42 BPM equivalent. Source unknown." The file was archived. But the locals didn't need data they already knew. By 2015, ecological aerials showed the Ocmulgee tract thriving, while surrounding counties suffered drought damage. The Forbidden Corridor, as locals called it, held its color. Its trees grew denser, roots deeper. Satellite NDVI readings normalized difference. Vegetation index spiked higher than any nearby region by 27%. Something, or someone, was keeping it alive. The Georgia Forestry Division sent drone teams to inspect illegal growth patterns. One drone lost signal mid-flight. Another returned with corrupted footage, distorted static frames smeared by motion blur. But a handful of stills survived. Frame 418, timestamp 004312, shows forest canopy from above shimmering faintly as if disturbed by unseen motion. And in one frame lower right corner, a figure at ground level, elongated shadow upright posture blurred at edges. Analysts debated compression errors. But heat readings tell another story. The area around that shadow registered 3 degrees Celsius cooler than its surroundings. In full daylight, in full. No biological organism absorbs light that way. So what does? The deeper they looked, the more data refused to obey logic. Sound recordings captured untraceable low-frequency pulses, 18 hertz matching the threshold of human fear response. Sensors malfunctioned, batteries drained, lenses fogged from within. The more machines entered, the more the forest pushed back, quiet, polite, decisive. It was as if the ecosystem itself was enforcing a boundary, a border invisible to law, but absolute to presence. In 2019, the Environmental Studies Journal published an article, Unexplained Environmental Stability in Post-Agricultural Southern Forests. The author never mentioned the name Panther, but in her acknowledgments, one line stood out. Dedicated to the memory of Samuel Larkin, who first listened. That author was Anne Russell, the same researcher who 70 years earlier had annotated Larkin's file. She'd returned older, silent, methodical, carrying the weight of decades. Her paper ended with a single sentence. In a land stripped bare, something remains determined to remember. The science could not name it. The data could not define it. Yet every figure, every graph, every wavelength whispered the same truth. The forest still breathes around an unseen witness. What once was folklore now wears the armor of measurement. And each proof, each number, each calibration only deepens the mystery. Maybe that's what the Midnight Panther always was. Not a beast, but an equation. Balancing loss and memory. Protecting the last uncut silence left in the South. By the time the 21st century found its rhythm, the old forest had outlived its witnesses. Sam Larkin was long gone. The researchers moved on. The archives gathered dust. But the Ocmulgee Bend, still green, still silent, never surrendered its mystery. And then came the storm. April 2021. A Category 3 hurricane grazed southern Georgia, its path cutting close to Telfair County. Satellite feeds tracked its fury winds screaming through farmlands, towns erased in hours. Yet when the storm reached the Ocmulgee corridor, it hesitated. The eye shifted west, a deviation of 6 miles, then curved north again. The forest stood untouched. Every neighboring tract fell, except one. The post-event analysis listed it as a minor atmospheric deflection due to terrain elevation. But topography maps show no such elevation. The land is flat. Flat except for that small ridge of untouched green, the same shape that appears on every thermal scan since 1935. It was as if the storm had looked and decided to pass around. When meteorologists overlaid data from the past 50 years, the pattern repeated every cyclone, every flood, every fire. The damage skirted that corridor like water flowing around a stone. The files labeled it Zone of Persistent Stability. But the locals had another name. They called it the Watcher's Line. That's when the questions began again. Could consciousness belong to land itself? Could an ecosystem remember, resist, redirect? A team from Georgia Tech visited the site in late 2021. They installed barometric sensors, sound traps, thermal drones, and one experimental unit capable of detecting electromagnetic fluctuation in subaudible frequencies. The first night, everything worked. By the second half, the instruments had gone dead. Their batteries fully charged at dusk, read 0 by dawn. No heat damage, no water intrusion. Only silence, as though something had reached through the air and pressed off. The lead engineer's field report describes a sensation he couldn't quantify. Like standing near an unspoken thought. He wrote that line twice. Underlined it. And then, for reasons no one explained, the project was shelved. But one intern, a young man named David Holt, saved the audio logs. He played them later in a studio in Atlanta, filtering out noise. What he found changed everything. Between midnight and 100 a.m., Under the layer of cicadas and wind, there was a rhythm. Not mechanical, not random. 42 beats per minute. A pulse deep, consistent, fading in and out like breath. Holt didn't call it heartbeat. He called it presence. When he played the recording for Dr. Ellison, now retired, her hair silver, her voice thin, she listened without speaking. After a long silence, she said softly, "It's still listening back." Those words closed the loop. 86 years after the first report, the legend had found its echo, not in fear, not in sight, but in vibration. The forest itself, breathing. From that moment on, interpretation divided. Half the scientific community dismissed it, environmental harmonics, seismic resonance, microtremors. The other half, the quiet ones, began to suspect something deeper. Because when they filtered the data again, when they inverted the frequency, the rhythm formed a pattern that matched human respiration exactly. Inhale, exhale, pause. Every 42 seconds, the forest breathed. And then once, at 02:17 a.m., a deviation, a shorter breath, followed by a sound like a low sigh, almost a word. Technicians replayed it 100 times. Some heard wind, others heard something else, a shape of syllables buried in static. One linguist from the University of Florida thought she recognized the cadence, not English, not modern Muskogee, but an archaic inflection used in Creek ceremonial songs. The translation, imperfect, but close to still here. After that, the recording stopped. The sensors went blank. The forest once again returned to silence. For months, the team debated whether to publish. But then one of them, a geographer named Laura Kent, discovered something chilling. Using aerial LiDAR imaging, she reconstructed a topographic model of the Okmulgee corridor. The ridges, valleys, and waterways formed a faint outline, symmetrical, elongated, curved along the riverbank. When overlaid with historical tribal maps from 1830, the shape matched an ancient ceremonial boundary, a guardian's path described in Muskogee oral history. The path of the one who keeps the forest from forgetting. 1,000 years ago, it was only story. Now the ground itself traced it back. The discovery forced a question that no dataset could answer. Was the Watcher an animal that became legend? Or a legend that became the forest? Maybe both. One thing was certain. The boundary remained unbroken. No industrial permit, no bulldozer, no road project had ever succeeded past the line. In the last century, every attempt had failed legally, financially, or mysteriously. In 2022, the state proposed a development plan to build a highway connector through that same zone. Environmental surveys were ordered routine. When the team arrived, they found the soil saturated despite weeks without rain. Instruments failed to calibrate. By the second day, one bulldozer sank axle deep into mud and couldn't be pulled free. The project was abandoned within a month. The report concluded with bureaucratic precision, unsuitable terrain due to soil instability. But local headlines read differently. The forest said no. The phrase caught on. T-shirts, bumper stickers, online forums, all bearing the same motto. But beneath the humor lay something older, humbler, true. Because that's what the legend had always been, the land's refusal to forget. The scientists left. The machines fell silent. And once again the forest stood alone, humming softly under the weight of its own patience. A documentary crew visited the site months later. Their cameras caught long shots of the river, turning under twilight reeds, bending fog, folding light, shivering on the water's skin. One cameraman swore that as he panned across the tree line, the focus shifted on its own, as if pulled towards something that wasn't there. When they reviewed the footage, a shadow appeared right side of frame, half obscured by mist, still. Upright, watching. No roar, no movement, just a presence. The director refused to use the shot, too unbelievable, too subtle. But the editor kept it anyway, the last frame of the film. A silhouette in fog, two faint points of light, then fade to black. And maybe that's the only ending it ever needed. Because for all our sensors and satellites, all our data and doubt, the oldest truth remains the simplest. Some places remember, some silences are not empty, some shadows are not absence, they are memory made visible. And somewhere deep among the pines of Georgia, something still walks at the edge of sight, unhurried, unseen, untouchable, not hunting, not haunting, only guarding. The watcher. The last echo of a world that refused to vanish. What if the forest was never meant to be silent? What if every whisper we called wind was simply the world, remembering its own name? Because when you stand in the Ocmulgee woods, when the fog rolls low and your breath turns slow, the silence isn't empty. It's layered, like sediment, one century resting on another. Each pause carries the echo of footsteps that walked here before roads existed. Each sigh of pine remembers the axe that never reached it. And somewhere, just beyond your sight line, the old rhythm begins again, the breath of something that refuses to end. The watcher, the midnight panther, the memory with four legs. Maybe it was never a creature at all. Maybe it was the land teaching us how to listen, how to feel the pulse of everything that survived our forgetting. Science will keep trying, measuring, naming, explaining, because that's what science must do. But the forest doesn't argue. It just waits. And sometimes it answers. Not in words, not in noise, but in the hush that follows. In 2023, the state satellite passed again over that corridor. The thermal scan still showed the same shape, cool breathing untouched. One technician new to the project circled the anomaly and wrote in the margin, same as 1982, same as 1935, same as always. And maybe that's the point, that not everything we inherit is meant to change. Some things are meant to hold their ground, to stay unbroken, unmeasured, unnamed. Late one evening, I drove that road myself. Route 90. The trees leaned close, their silhouettes trembling under the headlights. For miles, no radio signal, no engine hum, beyond a low murmur. I pulled over where the map showed the river bend. The air was heavy still. No wind, no birds, just the slow crackle of cooling metal from the car's hood. And then, a sound. Soft, rhythmic, almost a breath, the same 42 beats per minute that Dr. Ellison once wrote about. I stood there listening, heart trying to match it. Lungs sinking to something older than language. For a moment it felt like the world had paused, waiting for acknowledgement. Then it passed, not away, but through a weightless motion that brushed skin without touching. The pine needles swayed once, then stilled. I didn't see eyes. I didn't need to. I understood. Because in that silence, vast, fragile, eternal, there was no separation between the watcher and the watched. Only the act of remembering. Maybe that's why Sam Larkin stayed. Maybe that's why every ranger, every scientist, every passerby felt the same quiet unease. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. We fear what mirrors us. And the forest in its patience has always been the clearest mirror of all. What if the legend was never warning us? What if it was reminding us that silence is not absence? That watching is not waiting? That memory, when left unspoken too long, begins to take form, to move, to breathe. Perhaps that's what the panther became. Not an animal, but the physical shape of memory itself. A sentry made of sound and stillness, guarding what we tried to bury beneath roads and laws and reason. And if so, it succeeded. The Ocmulgee corridor remains untouched. The line holds. The trees whisper, the river bends, and each dawn the fog rises like smoke from an altar too ancient to name. Some nights locals still see the eyes, amber distant, neither threat nor comfort, hovering just above the brush. They don't tell the papers anymore. They just nod quietly, like greeting an old neighbor. They know better now, because the legend has stopped being story, it's become rhythm. A rhythm in soil, in roots, in air. A rhythm that says, still here, and maybe that's enough. Somewhere the forest exhales. Somewhere a pine needle falls. Somewhere a sound moves across the water. Soft, slow, deliberate. You can stand there if you like. Hold your breath. Listen. If you're quiet enough, you'll hear it too. Not roar, not wind, just the sound of remembering. The same silence that carried Sam Larkin's footsteps. The same stillness that turned storms aside. The same pulse that beat under every scientific graph and every mythic verse. A voice without language, saying only what the earth has always said. Do not forget. And as the camera fades, the frame dissolves into blue-gray mist. The pines swaying in rhythm to something unseen. The narrator's voice softens, almost a whisper now. In the end, the forest kept its promise. It remembered, when we did not. The music drops to a single note, a low hum that blends with the wind. The screen darkens. Two faint amber points shimmer, then fade. Next time, we'll follow another silence, another shadow along a different riverbank, where stories still breathe beneath the moss and the moonlight. Waiting to be found again, because every legend begins the same way, with someone who finally stops speaking and starts listening.